Hey Jenna,
Hey, Dom.
how you doing?
Oh, I'm still overwhelmed. I mean, I had a night last night. Although I shouldn't say I had a night last night. I was watching one unfold on multiple different levels.
Oh, okay. I
Well,
want to hear about
basically,
this.
okay, we're not a news show, but there was a lot of news. So we're going to talk about it in a few. All right,
Sounds good.
right after the start. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. Okay, so last night, and first of all, I want to say that we are very intentionally not a news show. We are a podcast about journalism.
Correct.
However, last night, my Twitter feed was bananas because half of it was about the New York Knicks. I'm a huge Knicks fan because, listen, it's part of like if you're going to be in the New York area and pay attention to sports, at least one of the teams is going to pull your heartstrings. And for me, that's the Knicks.
I mean, that's the Mets.
Oh, well,
Just so
see,
you know.
so then we're both accustomed to heartache.
Yes.
So the Knicks are in the playoffs. This is the first round. They are battling it out against the Philadelphia 76ers. And I'm sorry, a game they should have won, they lost in overtime. And it was one of those like classic Knicks where like they snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Like just what am I watching here? Anyway, so there's a lot of turnovers, there was a lot of problem, but I believe that they can pull it together. That's not the point. The other point is that the other half of my timeline was filled with, again, mostly New York reporters because we've been in the New York City area talking about the encampment and the protests that have been taking
Mhm.
place at Columbia University. Now, again, we're not a news show, so it's not necessarily what I want to say about the story itself, but I do want to comment on the unbelievable work that the student journalists from WKCR FM did covering their community, their college campus community, and the city response. Because if you were, I'm sure by now it's all over TikTok and Twitter and every place else and on the news, like the NYPD was seen marching into the Columbia campus. I mean, it looked very foreboding. They broke up the encampment, they arrested hundreds of people. It seemed to have gone pretty smoothly. By the way, as smoothly as something like that can. But again, the work that the student journalists did, um, I just thought was absolutely phenomenal. And so that was the two juxtapositions. It was people like screaming and cheering and screaming and cheering
Mhm.
about the Knicks, and then also people reacting to the reporting that was coming out of Columbia about what was going on. And it was a very weird night for my
And
Twitter feed.
And again, for the Columbia journalists, I think, like we were, saying, it shows the importance of local journalism,
Oh,
of being able
completely.
to talk about the community that you're in.
Yes. And
Um,
being part of the community
yep.
that, yeah, because
So,
there's nuances that, and that was something like, I mean, listen, I am, I guess, on a bit of a news hiatus now, because since I'm not covering it day to day like we used to, but a lot of the reporting that I've seen from other reporters have all commented on how these student journalists, because they are the local journalists for Columbia, have been able to pull out nuances of this story that more larger national outlets have not. And again, nuance is really where the
mhm.
crux of every story lives. So hats off to those kids.
I'm
Young
with you.
adults, I should say. They're not kids.
Yes. I guess let's look at the rest of our other headlines, right?
Oh, yeah, we've got a
Um,
few.
so we'll start off with, now this is from the Wrap. It's the headline is TheGrio lays off video and pod team over strategic changes, and it's TheGrio is Byron Allen's multi-platform media outlet catering to Black Americans, laid off staffers, and a restructuring effort that is also eliminating the managing editor's position, along with members again of the podcast and video team. Um, and over here, they have a statement from Allen Group Media that says it's making strategic changes to better position the company for growth that will result in expense and workforce reductions across all divisions. But the company declined to, I guess, address the specific layoffs. So um, that
Can I
is,
just say that that statement at this point feels like boilerplate? Because I feel
it
like we've heard
does.
that from numerous media outlets.
I know.
Strategic changes to better position the company for growth that will result in expense and workforce reductions across our divisions. Like, I've heard that several times over. And what exactly that means, of course, is going to vary from organization to organization. But it's the kind of thing where, like, you said words, but I don't know if you said a thing.
I agree with you. It sort of becomes boilerplate at this point,
Yeah.
and which is like you get to a certain point, you're like, what are you actually saying? But yeah, um, so that is what is happening. That was that headline. Another headline. This actually I saw in both Billboard and Real Chicago, which is Audacy, which is a radio company slash media company, um, where it says that they are laying off 2% of their workforce. Now, the company did file for Chapter 11 back in January. Um, and they are, according to this, now I'm reading, this is from the Real Chicago article. It says Audacy announced a round of layoffs affecting nearly 100 employees with significant impacts on WBBM in Chicago and 1080 WTIC and AM in Hartford. The cuts come as Audacy aims to position itself for long-term growth. The company, same kind of thing. It says it's in, it's trying to best position itself for long-term growth. So it's making some of these cuts. Um, yeah, just another
More
uh
positioning,
more position.
with cuts, and what exactly does that mean? Because again, like, positioning yourself with cuts means what for the staff left over, or for the content you're going to continue or maybe not continue to put out. I don't know. It's just, yeah, it's a boilerplate statement. Well, speaking of my current obsession with all things NBA,
Yes.
I had a headline, and that was that my one shot of dopamine in the wintertime, TNT's iconic NBA show, Inside the NBA, is in major jeopardy. Now, this is according to SportsIllustrated.com, which I think we had previously announced had like shut down completely. They have been resurrected and come back to life because Easter or something, I don't know. But anyway, so they put out this report that NBC slash Peacock, I'm not sure which name they prefer, but anyway, NBC is making an aggressive bid. This is how it was written, to steal the NBA from Turner Sports. Now, for anybody who doesn't follow the NBA, here's the deal. Inside the NBA is a real-time commentary and sports analysis show about obviously basketball games. And usually, during the regular season, they'll cover, the regular season games, which unless you're like a fan, most people aren't really watching. But the way it's not just sports analysis in terms of talking about stats and averages and injuries, which they do get into, but it's also the camaraderie of the four hosts. There's Ernie Johnson, Kenny Smith, Charles Barkley, and Shaquille O'Neal. And you see them like joking with each other and making fun of each other and all of this, like, it's as silly as it is serious. And so that makes it, like I said, my dopamine hit in the middle of winter. But at the same time, what makes the show so magic isn't just the four hosts, it's also their interaction with the crew. They frequently break the fourth wall and will talk live on television too, like their producers and their cameramen, and like they'll reference them and their banter. And it's the entire crew that makes the show really the magic that it is. And so if another media outlet, be it NBC or, a possibility that maybe Amazon picks up the show, I don't know, um, takes Inside the NBA as part of the TNT deal, which, by the way, is running rumored to be something like 2.5 billion. God, I wish I had access to that kind of disposable cash. But anyway, so um but they might just like try to take the hosts and not the crew of the show because the crew is with TNT, and like it depends on how that gets handled. And listen, the loss is part of life. I understand that. I've become painfully aware of that very recently, but I would be very, very, and I think a lot of NBA fans would be very, very heartbroken to see Inside the NBA gone, or to exist in another way so that you're not getting real time commentary about basketball games as they're happening. So, yeah, that was my other
Well,
pick.
well, as you can tell, now I'm not the biggest sports person, although I have a couple of sports that I do enjoy, but I don't really don't follow that many of them on a regular basis, but also hearing your passion for them. And also, I think this is what's interesting too, is about how this landscape is changing, even within the sports world, which is making a lot of money for a lot of streamers.
Mm-hmm.
And just hearing again, there's just this, uh, I guess it just feels like things are so there, you don't have that stability, and that creates this, content that we've all grown to love. That's become that, you just feel like you just don't know, even if it's popular, that it's going to still be there. It doesn't really matter because how the market's changing. So it's really interesting. So I guess we'll keep an eye on that, and
We
you'll
will,
keep us
but
posted.
I absolutely will. But lack of stability and how to navigate
Yeah,
that is a
yeah.
perfect lead in to today's big interview. How do you brand yourself as a journalist? This is a question Dom and I have struggled with ever since our layoff in December of 23. Now, traditionally, we both thought the media outlet was the brand, and our work either did or did not fit within that brand. But aside from cultivating a record of nonpartisan honesty, we really didn't think we were supposed to have a brand. Then we found ourselves in a job market that was so crowded with other laid off journalists, Dom and I quickly realized we had to establish our own brand, and quickly. So we did what everyone else of a certain age does when trying to figure out this new media landscape. We turned to journalists younger than us. And no one stood out more than Phil Rosen. Phil is a business journalist who quit his job, and we're totally going to circle back to that. But he also has a financial news newsletter, Opening Bell Daily, and created the professional community group, the Journalist Club. And he joins us now. Phil, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's seriously, I'm so fascinated by everything you're doing. And so, first, I want to start off with the top because I am baffled by this, like, branding yourself as a journalist thing. What is a journalist brand? Because most of us don't have a marketing degree, we don't exist in this world. What does that mean for a journalist to create their own brand and market that?
That's a great question. I think your brand for journalists or non-journalists is it's whoever you are and whatever you want to be. And for myself, that's really I write a lot online, and my brand almost accidentally has just become someone that writes a lot online. And the thoughts I share are almost secondary to the fact that I just produce a lot of writing. And that's been an interesting development over the years. And it certainly, I think, has helped me as a journalist because I've built sort of a reputation for writing a lot of content, and employers have appreciated that, I think, and other writers appreciate that. And I think when you talk about building a personal brand as a journalist, it that is your insurance for getting laid off, and not so much it'll prevent you from getting laid off, but it'll help you, I think, find a job the other way around.
Okay. And so when did you realize, or was this something that you already knew going into this business? Because I feel like for people my age and Dom's age and maybe older than us, this is kind of news to us. But I feel like for your generation, you guys kind of came in knowing what time it was.
So for myself, I grew up with Instagram and Twitter, and LinkedIn was later, but social media was just part of growing up in the 2010s. And I've always, I guess, when I was finishing up college, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't really know what that meant. So I just started a blog and I started writing a ton of articles and essays online. And that's how I sort of got my foot in the door. Because I had no journalism experience, no writing experience. So I figured, well, the best way for me to get experience is to do it myself while, working another job. And that was sort of the inception of my own brand or as online presence, I suppose.
I feel like not everyone, especially journalists, can be a little hesitant with their online presence because they fear, let's say, whether or not they can be perceived as being biased to a story, or maybe they can perceive themselves as being, I don't, or sometimes it's just about privacy. Um, so how do you see balancing being a journalist and creating your brand for someone that's comfortable for that person, for that journalist?
So what I've observed among colleagues and other journalists, most will share their stories, articles, and just links, and then maybe there will be a blurb about the article. And I think that's a great step to take because there are also plenty of journalists that don't share their work at all on any social platforms, even though it could take
Wow.
as little as 2 minutes. Um, so I think the first step is getting comfortable sharing your work, but then to differentiate yourself, which I think is sort of the seed of a personal brand, is that aspiring to differentiate just a little bit. Uh, Sharing the story behind the story, I think, is the most natural way to, I suppose, get people to know you as a journalist. And for example, what I do often, I'll put my link in a post, but then instead of talking about what I wrote, I just talk about how I went about writing that thing or why I wrote it or where the idea came from. So, if I'm writing a news story and it's about, you know, Apple stock, for example, or even Apple CEO, if it's news, odds are there will be 100 other articles that are pretty identical to mine that publish on the same day. So when I post about it, instead of writing what I included in the article, which is going to show up on every news site anyway, I will write about why I picked the angle I did and who I called and how long it took me to write this piece and the background reading I may have had to do, something like that. And I think that makes the article a bit more three-dimensional because then readers or even other journalists can see the process, and then the story becomes the process instead of the
Hmm.
news headline. And I think that's maybe makes a social post a bit more dynamic.
It's like it's basically I've noticed even a lot of documentaries that come out. People love hearing how did the story come about and how did it all like what was the origin story and what did it take? Because I think a lot of times people just think they see the work and then they're just like, oh, that's easy. Like, but
Yep,
you actually put
Mm.
a little bit more of a gives a little bit more dimension to what you're telling in terms of the story.
I think so. And these I think these things, giving the backstory of a story, those are details that journalists already know implicitly, but I think the problem is people think journalists will think it's not interesting enough to
Yeah.
share, and the obvious details to them are actually super unknown to readers or anyone else other than the journalist, really. So those are, I think, a big lesson for me early on was what may feel obvious to me is pretty much only obvious to me. And if
Mm-hmm.
I can remember that and remind myself of that every single day, then I have actually way more to say and way more details to share that people might find interesting. Um, so that's actually quite an easy thing to do. Just share the things that are obvious to you, and most people, yeah, and you'll stand out quite quickly.
That's so interesting because we were speaking with a journalism professor not that long ago, and one of the things that he was saying that he tries to make sure impress upon his students is how do you talk to strangers? And I've done that for so long, I don't even give that a second thought anymore. But it wasn't until he said it that I was like, oh, that's right. Because the first few times, go out and get tape, which is a common thing in broadcasting, like is daunting. How do I stick a mic or a camera in some stranger's face? Now I do it with no boundaries. Anyway, but how I'm wondering, is it important or does it help to be able to have, I don't know, a difference between your professional self online and your personal self online? Because again, so many of these platforms seem to really thrive on people's personal narratives. But again, as journalists, we're not supposed to, I don't want to say be fully human because that sounds terrible, but we're, we're supposed to be impartial, and human beings are not impartial.
Totally. I think the problem, uh, not the problem, but the hesitance from a lot of journalists I've spoke to is wondering whether a personal brand damages your credibility or
Yes.
your objectivity, and that is a super valid point. And something, I'm certainly not advocating, and I don't practice myself, like sharing explicitly your politics or your motivations or anything like that when you're telling the story behind the story. So I think there is our job as journalists is to be careful with our words, and I think that goes to your stories but also your social posts and how you show up online. um, and if you're careful with your words, I think there's you should be able to practice and get comfortable enough sharing without damaging your own credibility, I think. And like, I've not had any feedback where I'm talking about how I wrote a story and someone's come up to me and said, wow, I trust you less. I think I've actually found the opposite, because if I talk about maybe how difficult it was to get something on paper or to get a source on the phone, I think that actually has earned me some trust among
Hmm.
certain readers and colleagues in media, because it stories come out and then I think it's very easy to think, oh, it just sort of happens in, some machine produces these news stories, but it's these are, people write these things.
Hmm.
And um, when you can humanize yourself and say, yes, I was the one that reported this out and wrote this and spoke to the experts to deliver this information, I think that's such a good way to actually bolster your credibility, is humanizing the author, yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part. I love this conversation because I think it's sort of explaining a little bit about, you know, the idea of humanizing versus doesn't have to be an opinion. It doesn't have to be that you're going out there making a political statement or anything like that. But now, not all social media platforms are created equal. Some of them are a little bit like, do you find, Twitter used to be really popular, it still is amongst a lot of journalists, but it's also no, toxic to a lot of us. We feel, do you find any
People have
sort of
been harassed and doxxed and all kinds of crazy
Sure.
stuff.
Yep.
do you find any platforms that for you seem to get the most traction in terms of speaking to your audience?
I think my favorite blogging platform now is LinkedIn for sure. I think the organic reach is great and it's favorable for journalists, because I think the platform seems to be looking for sort of news authorities to be sharing content. So what I've found, sharing posts on LinkedIn typically get much more traction for me than when I do it on Twitter, but I still share on Twitter anyway. Sometimes I even share on Facebook, which I definitely don't, I use the least, but I think as a journalist, if you're writing something for your job, let's say
Hmm.
you write an article, you've already done 98% of the work. If you've reported, interviewed, and published something, and then the last 2%, which could take you, miles forward, is making sure that people see it. And I think that's where social media comes in, whether you like a platform or not, I think you're selling yourself short if you don't share it everywhere. So I try to, write something once and then publish it 6 to 8 times if I can, and
Mm-hmm.
that's, in bite sizes on Twitter or in long form blog posts on LinkedIn or even on my own personal blog. I'll be resharing bits and pieces of a story, Facebook, Instagram. These are just opportunities, I think, to give your story, multiple angles, the one that you've already written, and then also give yourself sort of a more, I suppose, yeah, it's a bit cringy to say over and over, but that is that personal brand building. If you show up on every platform, um, with your work over and over and over again, it's like you become known for what you do all the time. And if what you do all the time is sharing work and how you produce the work, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a great thing that any journalist would benefit from.
Okay, so now I'm wondering because again, mentioning the different platforms, they also all like almost require or ask for different things of their users, which can make then taking this one news story or this one broadcast piece or something and sharing it across. You can't post the same thing, I guess what I'm trying to say, across all platforms. It's going to perform very differently. It's almost like each one requires its own tweak and its own adjustment or whatever, which can, well, no, it's not that it can. It is a second job. I mean, there's a reason why social media managing is a full-time job. So, has anybody expressed to you, aside from me, I guess, saying that that alone can feel really overwhelming when like just creating, reporting out a story is a big lift on its own?
I think those are very fair concerns. But for myself, as someone who is active on, let's say, Twitter and LinkedIn, putting those posts together doesn't take more than 15 minutes from my day. And I'm posting multiple times a day on both platforms. So my sense is if you're already doing the work of your job, you have the content. It's just a matter of practicing how to repurpose it. So I don't buy into it being too much time or too big of a lift in addition to your job because
Mhm.
if you're already doing the job, that's the hard part and that is the lift. So if you don't want to, take the extra 5 or 10 minutes to repurpose it, um I think that's yeah, that is maybe you just haven't tried or haven't thought about it in a certain way or gotten enough reps in. And I think when you first start, yeah, it might take a few extra minutes, but when you do it every day for a long time, the minutes become quicker. And I think
Mhm.
also to your point about having to repurpose per platform,
Mhm.
I think that's true to an extent, but if you publish the exact same copy paste on every single platform, I think that's still better than zero, even if it's not optimized for that platform, or let's say you're going over the Twitter length or something like that. That's still better than giving up or not showing up at all. I think.
Okay. So one last question on this subject, because obviously we're both very curious. Um, there was at one point I was working for an organization that had a pretty clear and somewhat strict social media policy, meaning that they were going to be checking everything that you wrote. So again, to myself, and this was at the time, maybe I'll just say a few years ago, it seemed easier to pull back on what I was sharing altogether and just allow the station to do the promotion of work. But what I'm really getting from this conversation is like, actually, no, you did the work. You should be sharing what you did as well.
So I think especially at a big organization, it is not their responsibility to promote your work or advocate for you. Um, Not only is it not their responsibility, but they probably will not because I don't think it's in their best interest. So if you take it upon yourself to share your own work, I think you just position yourself better for being at that company, but also for whatever opportunity could come next, whether you're changing jobs or you get laid off. Um, I think having a reputation for doing the work and sharing how you did the work can
Hmm.
only help you, land opportunities or have inbound job offers. So Yeah, and I don't think it's fair to put that responsibility on your employer because if you're at a huge company and there's 500 reporters, how could they advocate for everyone or promote everyone's work? And also, I'm not sure if it's in their best interest.
Okay. Real quick though, can you unpack what it means that it might not be in their best interest?
Sure, I think generally in media or even I'm sure there are other sectors that this applies to, but if someone builds a really big social presence or personal brand, it's possible that I think it becomes more likely they leave their job. Um,
Hmm.
and if you're really good at your job, then it's not in the company's best interest for you to build a big following because then you might leave. Um, so obviously companies want to retain talent and so I don't think it's in their best interest for you to build an audience or a personal brand, but then at the same time, layoffs happen in media all the time,
Hmm.
and that's why I think individuals should really you have to look out for yourself. And layoffs can be arbitrary and random, and not always based on talent. So if you sort of shore up your defenses using your social presence and building a bit of your own audience that's separated from the company you work for, I think that only helps.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that we were crystal clear about
Sure.
that.
So no, the interesting thing, we're talking about these layoffs, and you sort of see like at this time, most people would think not the time where you'd want to quit, but a few weeks ago you actually left your job. You've been there for a number of years. It was your first, I read your piece where you said it was your first like adult job. And um so watching what's going on around you, seeing how the industry is sort of melting down, and what was it in you? Was it that said this is the time to sort of step away and start something new, something that's my own?
That's a good question. So for people listening, about 3 weeks ago, I left Business Insider after 3 years there, and I co-founded a new media outlet, Opening Bell Daily. And the reason, one, I mean, the simplest answer was it was an opportunity to do something I was thrilled to do. So I think that's the simplest answer. I was just so stoked to. Try to build something and make it awesome as best as I can. So that's one answer. But then um, I think pulling back a layer, it's a tough time in media, and I'm not sure if it's actually more risky to try something on your own versus staying at a big organization because as we've seen all year, big organizations, they cut people left and right, and you get a day's notice and then you lose your computer and your email and
Mhm.
your contacts. So um, that is a huge risk, and that's part of being in media, being a reporter. Um, and it's not necessarily new, but I think that knowing that made me believe, okay, is it really that risky compared to staying, going out on my own versus staying at a big organization? Um, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I don't think it's as out of balance as maybe cliches would make you believe. So yeah, startups are, uh, I think, considered high risk endeavors, but being being a reporter
It's
in media
just,
in 2024 is risky as heck. So um, yeah,
But
I'm
that's like
super impressed.
but that's something that I think that's the way this industry is changing, is the fact that I think more people are seeing that you have these, legacy media, big corporations, and really, if you're working for them, excuse me, you kind of are still this could happen to you. It's, instead of you trying to create something on your own, like I think so often people just don't give themselves that chance of course, circumstances are all different, but you look at it. I mean, for you, um, it's got to be scary, but at the same point, like if you don't do it now, when do you do it? Or somebody else will do it.
Yeah, and, I think over the last year, I've seen many, many journalists, friends and colleagues who have gone independent with, Substack or a podcast or, some new media venture, and that's inspiring to me. I think, okay, if you know, all these journalists who had pretty much the same job as I did, if they can do it, why can't I do it? And I think every journalist should believe that. Like, if I can do it, I don't even have a journalism background or a finance background, and I'm in financial journalism independently now. If I can do it, anyone else can surely do it too. Um, so the landscape is shifting, and I think a lot of this has to do with sort of this rise of the creator economy and influencers and people,
Hmm.
young people like 15-year-olds making $1 million being TikTok influencers, essentially, or just signing big brand deals with whoever it may be. That I think has sort of leaked into the traditional media space, and a lot of journalists have seen it and I think have been able to capitalize on it. Not that they're becoming influencers, but that these new platforms offer viable career options.
That's so interesting because the rise of this new phrase that blows my mind still is news influencer. I keep hearing that now.
Yeah, I don't like that one, but yeah, I have heard that.
Oh, well, anyway. Well, speaking of being a financial journalist, tell us about Opening Bell Daily. Like what's going on here? What would if somebody went and Googled that, what is it that they would find?
They would find the aspirationally best financial newsletter in media right now. And the reason I say that is because every day there's original reporting, there's analysis, there's a unique angle, and it's all free. So I think to get those things, typically you'd have to circumvent or pay for a paywall to get that content. But my partner, Anthony Pompliano, and I, we believe we are delivering really original and valuable financial information without putting that burden of cost on readers. So, yeah, if you Google Opening Bell Daily, it should be the first thing that comes up. And this morning, we sent out I think it was the 15th edition. And I'd like to believe it's the best one yet. And tomorrow's will again be the best one yet. And hopefully every day indefinitely it'll be the best one yet. Um, so it's yeah, I do believe it's only going to get better from here every day. And I think the readers that join early we'll get to maybe see that improvement, and I think that's an exciting thing. Like sort of joining a brand or a company from the start, and then watching how it evolves and develops. That's always been something I enjoyed doing. So now I feel like I can bring that product to readers, and maybe people will enjoy that as well.
Well, we would definitely encourage people to subscribe to Opening Bell Daily. And for the subscribers to Laid Off and Looking, we're hoping you're enjoying our journey too. I also wanted to ask you about the Journalist Club. There seems to be an effort, and it really feels, especially post-pandemic, because I don't, aside from professional groups, I don't really remember there being just community groups, I guess, where journalists could be together in community. Like professional orgs, everybody's got their business cards and they're jockeying for position and network.
Yep.
But this feels much more like relaxed, or at least that's what it seems from the outside.
So the idea behind Journalist Club is come make friends in real life with people that have the same job as you. So pretty basic, and it's as simple as it gets. There was no I never call these networking events. I think that's a maybe one differentiator, and I certainly don't want to be brandishing a business card at these things. It's started as one dinner with 10 people, and then I posted a photo of that on socials, and then all of a sudden I got 30 or 40 DMs asking to attend the next one. So then I did a next one, a second dinner, and then I posted that photo on socials, a group photo of 10 of us. And then now I think last night I just hosted the fifth dinner. So I've had dinner with about 50 journalists in the last, I don't know, 7 weeks. And we had one event. um, we had a happy hour and we did a panel talk at the happy hour, and that had 60 journalists attend from every major news outlet. That was super magical, and I was blown away by the turnout and the demand for something like that. And it was actually a panel talk on building a personal brand as a journalist. We had some great experts come in that I interviewed on stage.
Hmm.
And I think one reason that this has been met with a lot of positive feedback and demand is a lot of stuff is virtual now. And I think that's one really basic reason here, is that no one wants to do things on Zoom anymore. And I know we're sitting here on Zoom, but generally it's fun to go, have dinner or have drinks and meet people where you can sit next to them in real life and shake their hand or give them a hug. And that's been a really special thing that I've appreciated. And I've met so many amazing people. And the other thing I think here is the timing of Journalist Club. I didn't do this intentionally, but for myself, I just wanted to meet more people in media, and I wanted to make more friends in media, and I knew that wasn't going to happen on Twitter or virtually. So started hosting the dinners, and I'm happy to say I've made a lot of friends, and that's been really special. And I think other people have also made a lot of friends too through uh, coming together in person in these spaces. And it's been pretty exciting. I think it's really I actually feel that's some of the most important work I'm doing right now is just planning these events. And a lot of journalists have come and been recently laid off, and they've met people that are in the newsrooms they want to work in, and I think that's been really special as well. Just providing the places for people to connect.
It's interesting because I know, Jenna, we've talked to lots of, people on our staff when we were working,
Hmm.
and they too would always complain about not being able to connect in person because it is different. And I think it's great also when you differentiate between networking and connecting because it is different. I think
Yes.
sometimes you hear the word networking, it could be a turnoff to some people because it feels like you want something in
Yeah,
exchange for this, whereas connecting feels like might be some people who actually you're talking to, you could learn something from.
Well, I
I
would
mean,
just say from my own experience, not to interrupt, but from my own experience, networking involves you bringing your professional self and being on. Whereas, like just connecting, you just bring your authentic self, which is
mhm.
so much more relaxed. And my God, networking is exhausting.
totally.
you know, one part of what we love to do here at the end is to talk about how people became journalists. And your journey is interesting because you actually were pre-med, right? So, I mean, did you, can you explain a little bit about, so you went, how did you go from pre-med? And also, I'm just curious if you ever had the idea of wanting to be a journalist even before you went into pre-med.
So when I was in college, I had a science degree. It was pre-med or pre-physical therapy. I was on the fence between those two. And however, I have always loved reading and I've always loved writing. And I was writing every day in college, and I still finished my degree, but I figured, well, let me I don't even know what this means, but I want to try to be a writer. I want to make it as a writer, see if it's possible. And so when I graduated college, I did not go to the graduate program I got into, and instead I moved in with relatives in Hong Kong. So I moved around the world, and I got a job teaching English to 3 and 4 year olds in Hong Kong. And the whole time I started a blog, and I was writing blogs and essays about what it was like living in Southeast Asia as a new college grad. And a lot of the blogs were sort of coming of age ideas and just what it was like being an expat. But then, because I was writing so much online, um, the right person noticed, and they worked at a newspaper in Hong Kong, English newspaper, and then they hired me to come on as an editor. So that was my first signal at the time. Okay, if you do something on the internet enough, you will get better, and then if you get better enough, someone will notice. And that that's been like the story of my whole, I think, last 6 or 7 years. Just that cycle repeated over and over. And so I went to that newspaper, which was an academic newspaper, and I was writing profiles of doctors and professors. And then eventually I came back to the States, and I went to graduate school. I'm wearing my USC Trojan shirt here.
Oh, recognize.
Um, yeah, so I went to graduate school at USC in Los Angeles, and that was really my first exposure to what we call journalism. Because the profiles and writing I was doing in Hong Kong, it was outside the news cycle. So I didn't follow the news. I didn't know about the news. I was pretty under a rock in a lot of ways. Um, and then I went to school, and I learned, how to write a news story, how to write breaking news, how to write a lead, all this stuff, all the nuts and bolts of journalism. I had never had any experience in. I had just a ton of writing in my background at that point, tons of essays and blog posts and articles, but I had no idea what it meant to be a journalist. Didn't know what reporting meant and things like that. So that's how I went to school. And then after my graduate program, I applied to Business Insider's fellowship, and then I got it. And then after my fellowship, they hired me full time, and that was 3 years ago.
That is so impressive. One of the things that I love about those stories is that it's hearing about how many people's journeys, like it wasn't a direct path. Like I did this and then that and then that and now I love the fact that it like just winds and meanders all over the place.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us. This has been fascinating. Well, I'm constantly learning. That's been the great things about doing this podcast. There's so much. I think sometimes when you're in a discipline, you get so focused on that one little thing that you miss everything else. And so there's been so much that we've been learning, and this has been another big learning episode. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Phil.
Oh, thank you both. This was great. I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. All right, Dom. We've got to spotlight I mean, I don't know. I think it's a big story to you and me, but you
Yes.
share the story.
So basically, there was this podcast series that's put out by Audacy, which is
Which we
um,
just said was cutting people.
earlier in the headlines. It's an 8 episode original series. It's called "Who Killed the Video Star: The Story of MTV," and it popped up on um, my feed. It was for the episode that dropped today, which was when we're recording this, which was called the RIP MTV News. It's their episode 7. So it's hosted by former MTV VJ Dave Holmes.
Dave
Um,
Holmes.
I know, and it's so what it did was when they were recording this part of the episode of looking at the history of MTV, um, it was I guess they said around this time, the May 9th of 2023 is when MTV News closed for good after 36 years. And
Yeah.
so they kind of look at um, how did MTV News, how did it get started? The evolution of it. It was looking, they talked to a number of different VJ, or I guess MTV news correspondents, I should say, who worked for the channel. It's really interesting because, like you said, there's historically, there's so many moments of how MTV News got its start and why it was so important for a generation of young people
Yeah.
and needing a voice, because back then you didn't have social media. You're looking in the 80s, and especially in that 80s period and 90s, you didn't have social media for younger people to be able to communicate with or to know what's going on in your own world. And
I
they
was going to
really,
say to share the news of what was going on. You had
because
magazines, but you had to wait every month for a new magazine.
and also it was
My
something that
God, we
you could
sound so old.
I, I know. Why are
We had to
why
wait 30 whole days to
so
find out what had happened with the latest, with New Kids on the Block. 30 days. Anyway,
it was but it was it was something that definitely, I think, pulled younger people together.
Yeah,
It was
no, it
something
totally
that
did.
gave access to a world that did not exist before that time. Behind the scenes of music, which is so culturally important to a lot of us.
Hmm.
Um, Politics and going into politics in terms of, covering the election.
I was gonna
They
say they galvanized a whole movement. It was
choose or
what's
lose,
choose or lose
choose or
first,
lose,
and then rock the vote
and then rock the
afterwards.
vote.
Yeah.
They mentioned like the 90s, like the question of boxers or briefs to a presidential candidate was
Oh my
at that time
God.
period. But it really it was something of hearing how it all got started, and also it was run by young people, a lot of young people. And
Really?
that voice, yeah, there were a lot of them were who were executives at that place at that time were young people being able to have make sure like they're in their 20s. Being 30 was considered, that was like they were like, well, I think it was Chris Connolly who talked about he was 31 when he joined. He was like, well, I was over the demographic at that point. I'm like, oh my God, but that's true. When you're somebody who is a teenager, or even younger, or even in your 20s, like you look at people within your own peer group. And
Hmm.
it was just, talking about, again, the
Just
presidential.
FYI, sorry. If there's any noise bleeding through, my lawn's getting mowed. Just FYI, because I can
No, I
hear
don't.
it.
Oh, I don't hear it.
Okay.
But then they also talked about, of course, like a big moment, at least for me, was the death of Kurt Cobain.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember that moment. It was actually brought up. I think it was Dave Holmes who said this. Like he remembered going back to his dorm room, and it wasn't real until he heard Kurt Loder say that what that Kurt Cobain had died.
Yeah.
And it was like there are these certain moments, and you think of the correspondence they talk about, Tabitha Soren, John Norris,
Mm-hmm.
Allison Stewart,
Mm-hmm.
uh Susan Park, and then also Gideon Yago.
Allison
um
Stewart, who I've filled in for her at her current job a few times.
that's right.
Because now she hosts all of it at WNYC.
Yes, and it's Gideon Yago, right? I think I said Yago,
Yeah,
but
no, Gideon Diego.
yeah, it's
I
so
remember his name very, very well.
I remember Gideon because he always looked like a kid because he was, but he told the story of how when he started off working there, he was paid. They offered him, I think he was just graduating from college, but I think he said they offered him 30,000 a year. And I was just like, wow, this is
I'm not
how,
laughing at 30,000 because I feel like
no,
30,000 and this would have been the late 90s.
yes.
Okay, so 30,000 in the late 90s would probably be equivalent to maybe something like 50,000 or
Yeah, I guess
60,000
so. You know
now.
what?
But I'm just like sort of smirking at the fact that there's still people who are just like, so 30,000, what do you say? Like in 2024,
It's,
no, is what I say.
and
It's
a
not
number of them
gonna
talked about how
work.
they operated like a real newsroom too. I mean, which,
They were
why
a
is
real news. I shouldn't say that.
90?
I did not work there, but from consuming, it
Well,
felt like they were a real
Well, they
newsroom.
said they said that they would have their 9 a.m. pitch meetings, talk about
Yeah.
their sources for stories they're working on in the future, and then in addition to working on the stories that they were putting out that day, they talked about also the Week in Rock is kind of how it all got started, because it was really reporting on the news of the week, and then it sort of built up into actual news in the world of rock music at that time, and
Hmm.
then it sort of built up into what it became. And an interesting part of the conversation was like it's sad that it went away, but at the same point, and could you have something like that now? But they also brought up the fact that you also didn't really have the diversity at that time in
No,
terms of the stories being told.
no.
So today, while things are definitely
I was
more
going to say
like,
the week in rock, let alone. I mean, rock
yeah.
doesn't rule the charts for the kids anymore.
And so they were saying how, it served a certain period of time, but at the same point, like today, you can't really do that because there isn't one thing that sort of pulls everybody together. There aren't that many artists and that many people who really do that. So um, it's sad, but also, I guess, it was an interesting peek at that period of time in life of where news for, you saw young people who were starting to really develop their voice and lead into this world of social media because
Yeah.
that really it was a different space. You didn't start out necessarily, of course, there wasn't Twitter and there wasn't, you know, Instagram or Facebook, but at the same point, this was a way of communicating somehow because you would talk with your friends and you would somehow run into other
Oh,
people
completely.
of that. I mean, so like for you, what was something I guess that is there anything in terms of MTV News that for you, whether it was a VJ or something about it that connected, that you
Oh, well, I
connected
I
to?
mean, I lived for it completely. Like like
Yes,
that
yeah,
opening, I absolutely loved that. And hung on just about every single word. And of course, like Kurt Loder did become the Walter Cronkite for
yes,
kids in the 90s.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
Literally, I don't know if there was one particular story, or at least not one that comes to mind, that stands out in terms of, music or whatever, but um, you know, MTV News was how I, first learned about, oh God, like now there's, these big concert festivals, but I think maybe obviously there was Woodstock before it, but okay, so the
you,
coverage of Woodstock when they had the
yeah,
25th anniversary, because I lived in the area where the concert was held, so I worked at Woodstock 94.
uh-huh,
Also the beginning of Lollapalooza, I remember that.
yeah,
I didn't go to the first one, but I did go to the second one after voraciously eating up every single detail of what went on for the first Lollapalooza. Yeah, I mean it helped shape my um the information that I was taking in, it gave
yeah,
me there were bands and things like, of course, I came of age in the early 90s, so grunge was huge. And so there were bands that I was interested in, but actually hearing from them as opposed to just
yeah,
reading, articles in Rolling Stone or wherever else began to shape my perspective of, these musicians and etc. Who were only
yeah.
a few years older than me. So the fact that I put so much stock in what a bunch of 20-year-old millionaires had to say, but that's part of being a kid.
But yeah, to me, it was a great peek into a world that you would never have seen different people, heard different opinions that we do today. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that, I mean that you back then you just would not have had that and that access to some of that. It wasn't perfect, but it certainly was a good starting point of talking about these
It was
issues.
a good
So
starting point. I mean, of course, with 2024 hindsight,
exactly.
all kinds of
Yeah.
problems.
Yeah.
But still, I'm very glad that it did
Yeah.
exist. And I don't know, well, I don't know where anything goes from here, to be perfectly
Yeah.
honest. That's just a larger statement,
Yeah.
but I'm glad that it did happen.
All right, Jenna.
All right,
End of
Dom.
our
Well,
show.
end of our show. Another awesome week. Thank you,
Yes.
everybody, and we'll see you again next week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.